Good morning, everybody who's joining our webinar today. This is Dario Camplatero with Hill Group Mid-Atlantic. I want to thank everybody for taking some time out of their day. We realize it's spring break for many people and also Good Friday. So I appreciate you guys taking some time to spend with us this morning. We've got a very interesting presentation today in staying compliant with the remote workforce. Over the past year, obviously, many of us have dealt with various challenges associated with remote working and having to pivot to remote working. Now we're pivoting back to some sort of in-person environment, and compliance is always a big issue. So we're excited about that, and I'll introduce our speakers in just a moment. I just wanted to go through a couple housekeeping items on our slides here. Again, my name is Dario, the managing director here in Leesburg, Virginia. We also have Molly Jackson, benefits specialist. She is super coordinator of all these webinars and will continue to play an important part in these as we go forward. You know, I mentioned this before that we started these webinars in March of 2020, thinking it was going to be a weekly webinar we'll do for a few weeks as, you know, we kind of got through a tough patch as a nation, and here we are a year later. And, you know, we've probably done over 40 of these webinars over the past year, and we're going to continue doing those webinars. We feel it's an important thing to provide resources and tools and information to clients and people in the community, business community. We encourage you, if you have any topics of interest or something that you'd like to hear more about, please let us know. You can email myself or Molly. We're all ears. We've got plenty of good content in the queue. But we're always looking to get more and make these webinars as useful and valuable to you as our participants. So, but again, I want to thank Molly for all her help on these webinars. You know, I'll take a 2-second moment just to talk about Mid-Atlantic, Hill Group Mid-Atlantic. You know, we are one of the top 20 largest insurance brokerages in the country. And my commercial for Hill Group is, and I'll net it down to, we want to be a resource for you in all your needs when it comes to employee benefits, health and welfare, financial services, business insurance. And the biggest form of flattery for me personally as a managing director is when a client or somebody in the business community reaches out and asks for some advice, some counsel, some direction. And it may not be something in our standard quiver of services. Now, obviously, we do insurance. Employee benefits is our primary focus, but we do employee benefits. We do business insurance. We do 401k. We have in-house ERISA attorneys and compliance teams and HR professionals. Those are all things that we do. But when a client reaches out and says, hey, we have this unique situation, maybe it's payroll. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in a second. Or maybe it's, you know, they need some legal advice or commercial real estate. I find it as a great sense of pride when a client feels the trust and confidence in us to ask us for that kind of information. Again, compliance is today's webinar, dovetails right into compliance. This has been a huge issue for us. We took point on compliance way back at the beginning of the ACA, the Affordable Care Act in 2009. And we've made it a cornerstone of our business since then, and really advising clients, the business community at large, of all the challenges that are associated with compliance. And that those challenges have grown, and we anticipate a second wave of challenges that we've lived through over the past year. And today is certainly a topic that we will continue to live through. And with the new administration, we expect that there will be some additional challenges that will be coming up that we'll have to be dealing with. So again, you know, compliance is a cornerstone of our organization. Communication, again, we have a lot of people that look to us for information on communication. Over the past year, again, in the context of the pandemic, you know, employee well-being, employee engagement, mental well-being, those are really things that we spent a lot of time talking to our clients about, and really the business community at large has been more engaged than ever in really trying to provide resources and tools to their employee population through this challenging time. So we do a lot on the communication side. This just talks about 2 of our upcoming webinars that we have. We're trying to block these out in 2 to 4 sessions at a time because we are kind of in this transitional period with the new administration. We know more information is going to be coming down the pike that will affect various parts of healthcare and overall the insurance space. But, April 16th, we have Jeremy Schneider, attorney at Jackson Lewis. Many of you maybe have heard Jeremy. Great presentation, great content. He's going to be giving us an update on the vaccine and legal updates. A widely popular presentation. Jeremy's a great friend of the organization, and we're excited to have him present again. And then our very own on May 14th, Margie Grubik. Many of you may remember or know Margie from when we were doing in-person meetings so long ago. For the people on the call, we used to, and we hope to get back to doing in-person lunch and learn sessions. For the past few years, we were doing them at Ruth Chris and Tyson's Corner, which is not too bad of a place to have a meeting and get a lunch. And Margie Grubik has been really one of our constant presenters. She's part of the Hill Group team. She's a senior consultant with our organization and really a student of the legislation, what's happening. Margie really took the lead on ACA and understanding that those legislative components, and now is transitioning to be able to communicate and share information regarding what's happening with the COVID relief bill. So that's taking a lot of front and center information right now. So we're excited about her presenting on May 14th. And like I said, we'll have other topics coming in the queue. Let us know if there's something you're interested in, a challenge you're dealing with, a topic that is coming across your desk. Let us know. We're all ears and trying to present this information for you, for your value. And as we wrap up with my opening slides here, let me see if there's anything else. Our contact information, we'll let you know that we will be distributing a copy of the presentation today. So everybody will get a copy of that. And we also will be distributing a recording of today's session. So you can rest assured that you'll get that. And during today's presentation, we are going to encourage you to chat your questions. We will leave some time at the end of the session to allow you to have some Q&A. But with that, I want to take a moment and introduce Paylocity. Paylocity is a strategic partner of the Hill Group Mid-Atlantic. That means we have an enterprise agreement with them on a national level. And that does two things. First, it allows any of our clients or people that we work with or just people in the business community to work with us and bring a resource to them when it comes to payroll services. And Paylocity is a leader in that space. I think I'm not an expert in payroll, but what I will say is Paylocity is a company that has built their own technology, and they're really an innovative company when it comes to payroll technology, employee engagement, everything app related. They have some great recognition tools that they use through their platform, benefits administration. So really a leader in their space when it comes to technology and payroll. And years ago, I remember speaking to my team that, we're an employee benefits organization and we don't really have to worry about talking about payroll. And that was probably 10 years ago. And I've learned very quickly over the past probably 10 years, I would say, that we have to have conversations with our clients about payroll because it's such an integral part of the employee benefit package. What we see our clients trying to do is have an integrated, fully integrated solution. And we help our clients in various ways in creating that environment of, is it through their payroll vendor and payroll solution, and Paylocity is a great partner that can help with that. And through us and our Paylocity partnership, you get access to certain benefits and perks. So that's one component of our enterprise agreement. The second one for today is that we have access to really experts in their field when it comes to content. And today we're talking about compliance in this environment of work, in this remote work environment. We have two really impressive people on the call today, and I want to introduce them, Sherry Simpson and Corinne Tyrone. Sherry's been has over 14 years experience in the HR profession, working in benefits and payroll, understanding healthcare, local government, real estate, consumer goods, technology. She's collaborated with managers and senior executives to build partnerships and really create innovative strategies. And that's what we look like when our partnerships is innovation and strategic alliances and partnerships. And I think you'll hear from that today from Sherry. And she also hosts a podcast, which is really cool. PCTY Talks. I don't know if that's the way you pronounce. I'm assuming that's the way you would say it, which is exciting that she does that, helping elevate HR. And we are a big believer in elevating HR. We know it's a challenging environment to be in the human resource space, and making sure that you have a seat at the table and a voice at the table when it comes to C-suite conversations. And Sherry's a big promoter of that. And then our second speaker today is Corinne Terone, Director of Government Relations at Paylocity, and an attorney with more than 10 years experience. Again, legal research, payroll, HR compliance, which is a huge monster of a beast, I'm sure, and has only grown over the past decade. And she serves on the board of the National Payroll Reporting Consortium, leverages strong relationships with agencies, industry groups, and really is a tip of the spear of when it comes to compliance and the legal side of it. So with that, my long-winded brief introduction, I want to welcome Corinne and Sherry to take over the presentation for today. Thank you.
Thanks for such a great introduction. I feel like you should come to all our presentations.
You're welcome.
So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen just to confirm everybody can see it. Looks like that's the case. Like you shared earlier, we'd love to take questions throughout the presentation. You won't throw us off our game. So feel free to drop those in the chat and we'll get to as many as we can as we present. Otherwise, again, there'll be time at the end for us to answer any additional questions. So I thought I would kick things off talking a little bit about the shape of the workforce and how it has shifted so much. So back in February of 2020, only about 3.5% of the population was working fully remote. Then COVID happened. And I think it's no secret that the way we work has shifted a lot over the past year. 17% of employees worked remote 5 days a week before COVID. And now 44% of those are working remote 5 days a week now. We've seen the changing landscape of regulatory complexities. Corinne and I have spent a lot of time discussing, reviewing, looking at legislation and putting out content around it. We've seen a major shift in the needs of a hybrid workforce as the younger generation comes on, Gen Z. They are looking for a more dynamic workforce. Before, remote work was a perk, and now it's going to be seen as the norm going forward. And so there's short-term and long-term planning that has changed because of that. You know, even in our investor calls, we've gone from talking about 5 and 10-year plans to 2 and 3-year plans because the reality of life right now is we can't plan that far ahead. And then digitization and automation extremely accelerated. You know, we were already on this journey in the HR space, thinking about how do we become more digital? How do we curate better digital experiences? And COVID threw us headfirst into that. And so all of these things have kind of led to this point in time where employers now need to examine how do they stay compliant in this new environment, and how do they continue to learn about best practices. And so that's where we're going to focus today. Corinne and I are going to hit it from both sides of the equation. What are some things you need to think about from a compliance perspective? And then what are some of the best practices that we've implemented at Paylocity, but also that we're seeing in the industry?
Yeah, that's a great lead in, Sherry. And I think under these circumstances, when we're talking about working remotely, all of a sudden, even that started with compliance, because many of us were, even here at Paylocity, we only had a handful of individuals who were working remotely full time. It wasn't our business model that everyone did. I mean, we had more than many at around 40%, but now it's more like 100%. It's closer to, I think, 90 right now. But we all kind of had to pivot to remote work all of a sudden because there were many states and locals that issued shelter-in-place orders, stay-at-home orders, and employers were not allowed to continue their business operations as usual. So I think that that pivot of having to really quickly go to full remote work and more or less having to do so overnight really required us all to think on our feet and engage with a lot of tools that we didn't necessarily use every day before. Luckily, there are a lot of tools out there for this type of thing, you know, things like the tools we're using right now. So getting on a Zoom meeting, all the way to things that everyone has in their Microsoft Office platform, like Teams and OneDrive. We've been leveraging those super heavily, as well as things that are within our Paylocity platform, like Community. That has been a go-to kind of resource for us as we've gone to a full remote kind of environment. And having those tools available has, you know, made it more a little bit easier for us to adapt to that as quickly as we had to. And I like to kind of think about it through the lens of what if this had happened 10 years ago? I mean, the level of productivity that most employers would have been able to maintain without a physical location, a decade ago would have been vastly different than it is today. By contrast, we've actually heard and seen kind of through the studies and anecdotal information that has come out over the course of the year, that a lot of employers are seeing an increase in productivity even during the pandemic. And I'm kind of, going through a little bit of this backstory, this context here, and it kind of calling it back to something that Dario said right when we started, which is that even though a lot of individuals and a lot of workplaces are kind of starting to return to something that looks a little bit more normal, a model that may include being in the office or, having most people come back to the office, a lot of firms are actually kind of going in the other direction and saying, we've looked at what has happened over the past year. We've seen that our workforce has actually been able to continue to be really productive, continue to, work really well together and leverage all of these great tools. And we're thinking about, continuing to stay remote going forward. So this idea of compliance in a remote workforce, this isn't a COVID specific blip on the radar. We're not going to go back to everyone's in the office all the time going forward. So even if your organization is kind of looking at that and saying, I don't think that indefinitely working remotely is right for us, it might be helpful to kind of think through the lens of what if we had a little bit more of a robust work from home policy, and what would that look like for specific jobs if possible?
I like that you touch base, Corinne, on the remote work policy. I don't think we dive into it too much in our content here, but I know it's something that even at Paylocity, we've had to completely re-examine. Before we had pretty stringent language around, no distractions, no childcare issues, none of the things that frankly we're all living in right now. And so I'm glad that you mentioned that, because that's definitely something to consider as businesses are trying to survive either their temporary season of remote work, or if they're actually going to have a more robust remote work policy long term. There's definitely a lot to consider. So some of the things we wanted to talk about then are, how do we look at this employee life cycle and provide recommendations on the compliance piece? And then, like I mentioned again, best practices. And so this is how we're going to talk through the model today. So hopefully you'll be able to pull out nuggets for each piece of your process that we're going to talk about. And again, feel free to ask us questions as we go through it. It's a small group. Hopefully we'll be all best friends at the end. And we'd love to make sure that we're providing details to some of the slides that we're going to talk about. So Corinne, maybe we could start with recruiting.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to start right at the beginning of the employee life cycle. Before I do though, I feel like you gave me an opening to mention the fact that my kids' daycare is closed today for spring break. So living in this space of being a remote employee and having many distractions, if you see any small children pop into the frame during this conversation, they're here. So kind of starting at the beginning of the employee life cycle, there are a couple of issues to kind of be mindful of during the recruiting process. If you are hiring remotely, if you're hiring in places that you never, did before. And those are things like laws around salary history and criminal history. There are currently about 24 states and localities that prohibit employers from asking job applicants about their salary history. In most of those states and locals that have these types of requirements, an employer may not request an applicant's previous salary information or benefit information directly from that applicant, or indirectly from the applicant's previous employer. Generally speaking, if you're looking at an internal hire, this doesn't apply. And generally speaking, if that applicant discloses that information to you voluntarily, that's okay. But if they do, you're not supposed to use that information to determine whether or not you want to interview them, whether you're going to hire them, and how much you're going to pay them, and so on. These laws, as I mentioned, they don't typically apply if you already have access to that information because it's an internal candidate. Depending on those jurisdictions that you might be in, if you violate those laws, you may face kind of a variety of different legal actions or penalties, things like equitable relief, reinstatement, required to give that person a pay increase or payment of lost wages, that kind of thing, as well as possibly liquidated damages, attorney's fees, and so on. And that, again, it's totally variable by jurisdiction. It depends on, the situation. And as an employer in these states, you shouldn't ask applicants for their salary history, even if they're located outside of the state that you are located in. So if you're hiring an employee located in a state where salary history isn't permitted on the application, even if you're not located there, like your headquarters is not there and this is going to be a remote employee, if that state bans salary history requests, you may still be required to follow that state law, depending on where that employee performs the work. So if you have questions about your specific state requirements, I would always kind of point you first toward consulting with the state DOL or whatever the local governing body would be, or with your counsel. But I also would kind of invite you to step back from this and look at it from a legislative intent kind of perspective. I think that that's always a helpful kind of perspective to take when we're talking about compliance. These are meant to target that wage gap. They're meant to target those situations where minorities or disadvantaged groups tend to make less in their first job, and then if every subsequent job the way that they're being paid is based on that first one, then they never make up that gap. So the intent here is to create kind of a fair framework for hiring and compensation, regardless of any of those personal factors that the candidate is bringing into that conversation, which is kind of a perfect lead into the next type of law that you might see in the recruiting life cycle that is important to be mindful of. And those are ban the box laws. So ban the box laws are also sometimes called fair chance laws. And these are laws that prohibit employers from asking questions about criminal history on the job application. Again, these vary by jurisdiction, and there are many factors that are taken into account in the legislation regarding whether or not it applies to your organization, even if it may apply in the jurisdiction. And those are things like employer size, employer status, be they public or private, even things like industry. So there are 11 states that have implemented these types of laws for private employers. And 11 doesn't, sound like a lot, but it's all the big ones. So California, Colorado, Illinois, New Jersey, et cetera. So it's still a large portion of the workforce, even though it's not necessarily a large number of states. So certainly something that you should be mindful of if you're hiring a remote position, and the candidate could be anywhere. Some states do permit an employer to ask about criminal background during an interview or to conduct a criminal background check after the offer has been extended. And there are also oftentimes exceptions depending on the type of work. So for example, if you're hiring for a money movement position, you may be able to do certain types of background checks or credit checks. That would be an exception to this, so that you make sure that those jobs that have really stringent requirements around certain types of adherence would be met. There is also often a requirement that the employer notifies the applicant if they were not selected because there was a criminal background as a deciding factor. So if you've already extended the offer of employment and done a criminal background check at that point, and then decided not to choose that candidate because of something that came back there, you may have to disclose that was your reasoning. And again, kind of similarly to the salary history requirements, generally speaking, depending on where you are, if you're violating these types of requirements, there could be legal consequences, equitable relief, and so on. It's very similar in terms of the what type of damages you might get there. As there were for the salary history. So all is to say, if you're hiring a remote worker in a jurisdiction that you are not familiar with, you should certainly check with that state DOL or other regulatory body and just make sure that these types of requirements are not something that you need to be mindful of, so that you can then proceed confidently and cautiously in that space.
So when we think about best practices for remote work, one of the things that we've started to do that is kind of a combination of the digital transformation I talked about earlier and making sure that we're utilizing all the tools that we have at our hand. So creating video job announcements, I absolutely love this. I think everybody should implement it. My boss actually had an opening on our team, and so she posted this really great message on LinkedIn and tagged all of her direct reports and said, hey, hey, reach out to anybody on my team if you want to learn what it's like working here at Paylocity or what it's like working on my team. So I think it's our time to start to think about how do we create a remote experience from the very beginning. Again, you should be looking at your job descriptions to make sure they reflect the remote work in your organization, and remove any restrictions or language that you have in there that potentially prevented those job descriptions from being accurate the way they are now. Lean into conducting interviews via Zoom instead of over the phone. It does give you a great opportunity to see somebody face to face and read body language. The caveat I would add to that is make sure that you keep your bias in check, because now you're being invited into potentially their home, and maybe you guys don't agree on the same sort of rock music. So make sure that you keep those in mind as you're conducting those, and then offer training to hiring managers on interviewing remote. It is a little bit different. But there should be some of the same basic things that you extend to your candidates. You know, I recently interviewed for an intern, and I started off by saying, like, hey, if you need to grab a water or a bio break while we're together, feel free to do that. Just because we're on Zoom doesn't mean that those common practices you had before should go away. So really some great things to think about leaning into video when it comes to providing that great remote experience at the very beginning.
Yeah, I love that, Sherry. I would also, just from a compliance perspective, encourage you to anything that you're doing like that. I would always encourage you to do it consistently. I think, particularly in video format, if you're doing that for your hiring, like I love the idea, first of all, of doing the videos for job postings. I feel like it's this is not a compliance note, just a personal note. I feel like it really helps kind of establish more of a connection and like actually show the candidate something about your organization in a way that a job posting simply never can. I mean, if you read a job description, or when you're writing a job description, it really doesn't tell you anything about the organization or the team in a way that you can really get any sense for what it would actually be like to work there. But I think just like using the video for the interview process helps you kind of get to know the candidate, if you give a video job description, it really helps them kind of get a sense of whether or not they think they would like to work there or would like to work with you or for you. So I feel like I've never seen this before, within the last year, but I like it. And I think that that's likely to be the future. So that's just kind of a personal comment on that. But as far as the compliance pieces of that go, make sure that you're being consistent and not, doing video for one person and not another person, because those are the types of things that, later can kind of create a perception of discrimination, because it's anytime you're handling things differently, you wonder if it will create a different kind of bias. Because like if I see you on my video and I can connect with you and it feels more like a real interview than a phone call, does that sway my opinion, and so on. So kind of just something to be mindful of. So then now we can kind of move on to the purpose of this slide, was really to talk about I-9s. So I-9s are a favorite topic of HR professionals. I'm sure everyone on the line today is excited to hear these come up. And we all know that they normally require a physical examination of those employment documents. And we have to do that, live and in person. And we're supposed to take a look at those documents and make sure that they look legitimate. However, due to COVID, there have been temporary rules that have been put in place for making sure that you can still hire someone without necessarily seeing that in person. So temporarily, employers have been allowed to verify those employment documents remotely. And the kind of process that is put in place temporarily in order to execute on that is that the employer is supposed to notate on the employee's I-9 an in-person completed date once they're able to physically examine those documents. So if you hired somebody in July that you were onboarding remotely and you didn't get to do that, when you actually are back together in person, you're supposed to look at those documents and do the in-person completion date marked physically on that I-9. At that time that you're actually able to do that. And this applies to a third-party representative as well. So more specifically, employers with employees that are taking kind of physical proximity precautions due to COVID are not required to review those documents in their physical presence right away. But those employers must inspect those Section 2 documents remotely. So like you could do it on a video call like this, you could do it via fax or email, et cetera. And then you must, again, as I said, within 3 days of actually coming back together in person in the office, you must obtain, inspect, and retain copies of those documents. So just like a normal I-9 kind of experience, just with a slight delay between the onboarding process and the physical examination. So if you are planning on implementing that flexible option, you're supposed to provide written documentations of your remote onboarding policy to each employee. So all of the information that I just shared and kind of a rubric for how you would go through this is available on the USCIS website. So if you want to review that in more detail, that would certainly be a really great resource.
So I love talking about I-9s as every other HR professional does. But one of the little known provisions of the I-9 rule actually allows the employer to designate an authorized representative to complete the Form I-9. So this is a little bit different than what you presented, Corinne. Your process was if you had gone fully remote and that's not current and you're going to bring them back into the office, what does that look like? So with our remote population, the employer may authorize anyone except the new hire to review the I-9 form and identification documents, describe the documents on the form, and complete Section 2 certification. So what that really means is anyone. The Department of Homeland Security doesn't require the authorized representative to have specific agreements or other documentation for I-9 purposes. The representative need not be any particular qualifications, licensure, knowledge, experience, or affiliation with the employer. And no person is barred from acting as an authorized representative because of their affiliation with the employee. So options within a company might include other employees such as personnel officers, foremen, project managers at a remote location. That's a way to do it. Another way to do it is that authorized representative can also be the new hire's next door neighbor, teller at the bank, maybe the mail carrier. The employer can literally authorize anyone to act on their behalf. So stated another way, the person who views the original identification documents in the presence of the employee and describes them in Section 2 must be the person who signs the Section 2 certification as the employer's authorized representative, whoever that person is. So I think that's just an important thing to note as you think about long-term what remote work looks like. And if you're not going to be bringing people on board in any live setting for any period of time. So just an interesting thing when it comes to I-9 for you to consider. There was a great question that Dario posted in the chat that I thought we could address before we move on to the next topic, Corinne. And it had to do with if the candidate doesn't want to put their video on for a remote interview. I love this question. It actually came up recently on a podcast that we did about hiring those that are differently abled. And one of the recommendations that was given to us when hiring people with autism is for actually the interview to be cameras off. It can be an anxiety producing thing to have to perform on camera like that. So what I would say is set the expectation up that you plan for it to be a video interview, be very clear about it, but ask if they have any reservations about it. I think the more open and transparent you can be about your process and the intent for being cameras on, getting to know the candidate, trying to balance the, sway from in-person interviews to remote interviews. Those are all things to share. I don't think there's any compliance concerns, and I definitely wouldn't require it as part of the applicant process because you couldn't create a uniform application process if not everybody chooses to partake in that. Corinne, would you add any other additional notes for that?
I agree with everything that you just said. I think that I would kind of take that question from like the human lens more than the compliance lens, just because like if you kind of think about where we've all been this year and what we've been doing, like there have been many situations where people have been, kind of suddenly out of work and their kids are home with them and they're kind of trying to secure new employment, but maybe they're like little fingers trying to reach in the door behind them in the middle of the interview, which literally did happen to me recently. Like I was interviewing someone and like her kids were like trying to break in behind her. And I could just like feel that would be a lot to that would be a lot to like manage mentally under the circumstances, because you're already trying to make a good impression, you know. So like that's just one example. Sherry's example was also great. So, you know, I think having a policy that you try to implement consistently is the best thing to do, but also, you know, try to make exceptions where needed, where you think that that's the right choice.
Yeah. And normalize little fingers coming into office. If that's your culture, I think that's a really important thing to note, that, you know, if you have a culture where going forward, that's the norm, make it the norm in the interview, and get rid of those jitters. So
Yeah.
next topic though is tax setup.
Yeah. Yeah. I liked the normalized little fingers. I feel like we need like a t-shirt for that. So yeah, I mean, I think as far as like taxation, you know, there are a couple of things that are interesting for remote employees, and also particularly interesting during, you know, COVID times, as we're calling them now. So the first is Nexus. So specifically Nexus for remote employees. What is this generally, and then what is this during COVID? So um, if an employer has nexus with the state, then the employer is generally obligated to withhold income taxes and pay those taxes to that state. So what is that? Generally, it means that there's some physical contact that exists between the employer and the state. And then if that exists, then it is required that the employer withhold taxes. Nexus can be created in a variety of ways. And it can be anything from sales transactions in that state, or when an employer has a business location in that state. Those are really common ways in which Nexus is created. But state and local regulations vary on what creates Nexus. So when in doubt, I would always advise you to check with the applicable authority, or consult with a tax professional, someone who can really kind of help you navigate that in the specific new location that you're trying to hire someone. But for the purposes of our discussion today, it may depend whether Nexus is created on the nature of that work activity in general, but maybe not right now, because many states and localities are treating working from home as a result of the pandemic as something that is given a little bit of grace. Like they're not actually asserting Nexus, because even though, you know, as Dario mentioned right at the beginning, we're coming up on a full year of doing this, it really is theoretically temporary. You know, this person doesn't work from home forever. They're not one of those, you know, small percentage that Sherry mentioned on the first slide that are full-time remote employees. They just had to figure out how to work from their house, because we all have to socially distance. We couldn't all be in the office, et cetera. So a lot of jurisdictions are giving a lot of grace there, because there has been this huge swing in the percentage of individuals who are kind of thrown out of their normal tax setup and into a different one, particularly in places like Ohio and Kentucky, where I am, or Pennsylvania. There are just a myriad of local taxes, and maybe you never had an office in that place before, or never had a worker in that place before, and now suddenly you do. So I would definitely encourage you, under the circumstances, to just take a look, see what's out there, if there have been any grace periods or relief extended for those individuals you're not sure about. We actually do have a resource. If any of you are Paylocity clients, we do have a resource in Peak that kind of lays out all of the nuances and exceptions that are COVID related. So there are a lot of great resources out there like that that could help you kind of navigate that if it's something that's a little bit new to you. And then the next related topic is unemployment tax. So similarly, remote workers can create a little bit of complication in terms of unemployment. Remote employees working in states other than where the employer's office is located requires the employer to conduct a 4-part analysis to determine which state the employer is supposed to pay unemployment insurance for that employee. And you're supposed to go through these in order. So you start with localization of services. An employee's services are considered localized in a particular state if all or most of the employee's services are performed in that state. So if I take myself as an example, I actually am a full-time remote employee regardless of the pandemic. So I work from my home in Kentucky, as I mentioned earlier. I'm always here. My services are localized to this specific point. But if that were not the case, and I were if I were performing services in a bunch of different locations, like if I traveled to Ohio or Indiana on a regular, consistent basis, and I wasn't always sitting in one kind of space, my employer would need to go to the next test. The next test is base of operations, and the employee's base of operations would be established by the location from which the employee regularly gets their equipment, supplies, instructions, the actual physical stuff or information that they need to actually perform their function. So if you've already gone through localization of services and find that you can't localize them, the next step is base of operations. Is there a specific place that this person reports back to on a regular basis? And if that is also not the case for this person, the next place that you go is to place of direction or control. So where is your corporate headquarters or a regional headquarters, somewhere from which this person is receiving their marching orders, so to speak? Where's their supervisor, for example? And then the next one, if that also does not apply to your situation for whatever reason, the next one would just be the state of the employee's residence. So if none of those three tests can fit your situation, then the state of the employee's residence would be where the unemployment insurance taxes would be due.
I don't have any best practices for taxes from an HR perspective beyond lean into your experts. I know that you mentioned Pennsylvania as being a state that has a lot of city related taxes. So it's definitely good to just know those kinds of things as you go forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. I think especially if it's just a space like a physical location you're not that familiar with, that's really helpful. We also have geolocation software. I know a lot of other payroll providers have something similar too. So during that onboarding process, sometimes there are tools that make it easier for you to figure out where those taxes should be. And that I think in a general hiring a remote employee kind of situation, that can go a long way, especially if it's not a space that you've hired in the past. So if we are going to kind of move on to talking about training, which is our next kind of topic here, the main kind of issue that I would want to call your attention to is that there are a lot of states that require training that's aimed at the prevention of sexual harassment. And specifically, there are 6 states that require them, but kind of as I mentioned with like the ban the box and salary history, they're all the big states. So California, Illinois, New York, and so on. So even though it's not a big portion of the country geographically, it's a huge portion of the country in terms of workforce. For the states that do require it, the requirements, again, like everything else we've talked about today, are variable depending on location, but they tend to kind of follow the same guideposts in terms of what needs to be discussed. So often, most of them need to be about 2 hours in length. That can vary depending on whether it's a supervisor or an employee, but generally that's kind of the mark is about 2 hours per year. The content needs to be created by someone with expertise in the area, and there needs to be generally a mechanism by which the employee or trainee can ask questions. So they need to be able to engage with someone who can answer any questions that they might have about what they just learned. It's important to note here as well, I think that if, again, as I mentioned at the beginning, I like to kind of think about compliance requirements through intent and think about that even if it doesn't require, if it's not required of you to do that specific compliance thing for your organization, think about that intent and whether or not it might shape your best practices and your policies. Because specifically with things like this, there are many states in which it is not required. As I said, I think it's only 6 today that actually technically mandate that you provide this type of training. But the case law in almost every one of these states is really, really favorable to an employer that has actually provided this training, even in a situation in which it wasn't required. So, obviously with every type of compliance requirement, you want to assume that you're never going to end up there. You don't ever want to have to be defending a claim regarding sexual harassment in your organization. But this is the kind of thing where that small investment of, 2 hours a year can really help you later, if something ever does kind of show up on your doorstep that you weren't expecting. So I would be curious, Sherry, like if you have additional thoughts on that, like how do you think about these types of compliance trainings from a practitioner's perspective?
Yeah, I think what's important to note here is the difference between required by law and what you should be doing in your organization. With the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement, last summer, and all of the time and energy and focus being put into DE&I initiatives across our country, I think these types of trainings should be mandatory in your organizations. I think they speak to your culture, and I think they set the stage for how you're going to evaluate situations when they do come up, because you can set the baseline and the expectation. So definitely a best practice when it comes to those specific trainings is to have them. And the other thing I would say is, if you're evaluating trainings, try to find ones that are have relevant examples. I'm sure you have all seen terrible harassment training with just over the top ridiculous stuff that happens. And it's just not helpful, to be frank. It's much better to have really good content that can cover things around sexual harassment, but also harassment in general, learning about microaggressions. Some of those nuances can be difficult to always see. And so it's good to have a training that covers those kinds of things. Um, when we're thinking about training overall, one of the trends that I've really enjoyed seeing is this movement to more bite-sized content that's just in time. So if you think about, your own training and what you have to put out the door, maybe you have Paylocity's LMS and you're totally loving that and that's your great venue. Maybe you don't have that. There's definitely other things you can use. YouTube, for your younger generations, maybe you do a TikTok or a Snapchat, right? Think outside the box when it comes to this. A lot of content and a lot of messages can be put out there in under 2 minutes. So think about that. I really encourage you to think about that, and the pieces that you need. And then the benefit of utilizing an LMS is that you can create consistency. You can record sessions like this and post them after the fact for those that were not able to attend. Especially in this kind of Zoom fatigue world that we're in now, you can create some really great asynchronous communication where you're posting a video and then asking for feedback on it. So all of those things for you to consider when you're coming to training. And frankly, the more video content that you can put out there and the more digital you can move, you're going to save cost and you're going to save time. So I think that's definitely a bonus from a business perspective, and thinking about how to keep your organization up to speed on the really important things that you need to check the box on.
I love the idea about creating kind of small bite-size asynchronous communications. I think that's a really good call out, Sherry, particularly because you kind of mentioned Zoom fatigue, but I think kind of one of the overarching things that I've noticed too over the past year is just the span of the workday has really changed, and partly that has been because people do have kids at home, or they're not feeling well, or they need to go get their vaccine or whatever. There's a lot of intersection right now between work and life, as opposed to kind of having a clear cutoff at 5 that you're leaving and going somewhere else. It's the workday has really expanded, so people are often online working, trying to get through stuff, later in the evenings. And if there's a way for you to communicate with them in kind of a small little bite-sized chunk like that, where they can watch a 2-minute video at, 8 o'clock at night after their kids go to bed or whatever, it's a great way to kind of keep everyone on the same page. Even though you can't necessarily have everybody get together for a 20-minute discussion at a specific time of day. So anyway, really good call out there, I think. And in terms of performance management, I think as far as compliance goes with performance management, it's really all about document retention and documentation. So I think that's true whether you're talking to someone face to face, as you would if you were in the office together, or whether you're on video chat like we are today. The biggest area of concern in terms of compliance really is just protecting your organization from any future claims that may arise in the event that that employee relationship is terminated for whatever reason, either their side or yours. And in that case, having clear documentation documentation that you can point to about what happened and how did you get to the point of the termination of that relationship is really the best thing that you can have. It's also really important in those conversations that you're providing really clear and direct feedback, and then making sure again that you're stating that out. I also think that that's really helpful from the perspective of the employee who may need to come back to that later, because I think sometimes those conversations can be it can be difficult to hear, that you're not meeting whatever the expectation is, and it might be something that you need to kind of step away from and digest your feelings about a little bit, and then actually be able to come back later to what is actually written, so that there's not confusion about what was said and there's not misinterpretation about what was meant. If you can clearly document that information, not only is it protective for you later, it's also helpful for the employee later, so that they can really think about that and sit with that information a little bit.
Yeah, and I would say when you think about best practices in this space, in the remote work around performance, e- feedback loops. I can't say enough about feedback loops. Use your documentation as an aid, not as your crutch. So really lean into having those robust conversations, documenting them obviously, but then going back and giving that feedback, like, yep, you're on track, or you need to level it up, or you're not on track, let's reevaluate it. Again, like I talked about, you use technology to support the dialogue. I think, one of the biggest fears is, if you aren't a cameras on culture and you're doing now these one-on-ones, virtually, and you're missing that face-to-face, is things can get lost in translation. So it's the marriage of both really great communication verbally and then documented communication as far as tracking. And like Corinne said, you might not need it for litigation, but it's good to look at it from the perspective of, how can I help my employees succeed by giving them the good documentation on what they need to improve in setting those expectations.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of a natural segue to, so let's say it doesn't work out and you are ending that employment relationship for some reason. What are the compliance requirements that you need to be mindful of in that space? And there are a few things that I would mention in relationship specifically with a remote worker. And the first are that, depending on the jurisdiction that you're in, the requirements around how you furnish and when you furnish the last payment of wages may vary. So, for example, I think in California, if the employer terminates the relationship, then that last payment of wages has to be made immediately. But if the employee terminates the relationship, I believe you have 72 hours in which to do that. And that's really just an example, and just kind of shows that specifically in that jurisdiction, there's a specific way that you're supposed to be handling that. In some states, it's fine to wait until the next regular payday and pay by whatever method you normally would. But again, those requirements vary depending on where that employee sits. So I would certainly encourage you to check with that to make sure that you can meet those requirements if you know that you're going to be terminating that relationship for whatever reason. Additionally, I wanted to just kind of call out here that some states do require specific discharge notices. So some of them, you may be very familiar with, and some of them you may not. So I believe, for example, New York requires like a specific type of documentation be furnished to employees that has information, for example, like what's their last day, when do their benefits expire, and so on. And New Jersey, which is right next to it, does not require anything like that. So it's just kind of an example of how those requirements vary depending on where the employee is sitting. And again, I would also encourage you, like with any of these requirements, I would encourage you to make sure you're checking that every once in a while. These things change really quickly. I think at the beginning of this conversation, someone, kind of made a joke about how quickly things have changed over the past year. Absolutely true. And we're not really seeing that pace slow down to any great degree. So just because, you had someone in California 2 years ago doesn't mean that the requirements are the same today. So I would certainly encourage you to just make sure you're trying to stay current on what those requirements really are.
So that was our last topic, and I will end with, when it comes to ending the employment relationship, something that I strive to do as an HR professional is to have that exit experience be as smooth and pleasant as the new hire experience. And you can accomplish that whether it's a voluntary or involuntary termination by making sure that you're providing clear support and direction on what next steps are for the employee. Like Corinne mentioned, a lot of states have notification documents that are required. So build those into your process. These could be things like unemployment or COBRA eligibility. What I have found as a best practice is to create an exit checklist and put a process in place so that you can basically have a set to go package that you give people, and you know, based on which state, what packet they get. And then just be mindful of this part of the employee journey to lead it with empathy. You know, I think it's a way better experience for somebody to leave and know that they've left in a way that they've been respected and that you've been calm and empathetic and stuck to the facts as you're helping them move on to their whatever their next is. So I will end it there. I'll stop sharing my screen. If there's additional questions to come in, you know, feel free to ask. You know, like I said, Corinne and I are an open book.
Well, thank you both, Corinne and Sherry, for going over that information. It's really quite compelling. And, you know, I jotted down some comments, and there's certainly some questions in there, and we open it up to questions to the group. But I think your one comment about asking people, do you have any reservations about using the video? I think that's really good, setting the expectations up front. We find that very challenging, not only in our office with employees, but, you know, with clients and outside partners. So I think that's a really good tip. I think the whole tolerance of what can be done in a video call anymore, somebody talking, you know, the little fingers thing. I mean, a year ago, I would cringe if I could, you know, if there was a book out of place behind me, or, you know, you're on a call with an employee and you hear their dog bark. Now it's like, you know, anything goes, and it seems to be acceptable, right? Everybody's dealing with it. So I think that just brings down the anxiety a bit. But again, still really important. I think some of the challenges that I face is, and I think for many of our clients too, would be the onboarding process in a remote environment, right? You know, I always used a statistic that I heard that the first 96 hours of an onboarding experience for an employee is critical to their long-standing with the company. And, you know, we've hired only one, maybe two employees in the past year, and it's gone well, I think, for the most part, but you just don't have the same onboarding process that you did before, right? Taking somebody to lunch, or, you know, inviting them in to talk a little bit and things like that. I know there's some other workarounds, but I'd be curious on your input on that. The offboarding, just as challenging. We have, knock on wood, we haven't had to deal with that either in our organization, but I'm sure many of our clients are. So I wouldn't mind hearing more about that. And then the last thing I'll just ask is, we're moving to a place now where we've been very accommodating, I think, employers as a whole, of allowing employees to feel safe, comfortable, do what's right, if it's childcare, if it's their flexibility in their work environment. But I would imagine many employers now are going to start moving towards having to ask employees to get back into the office, or, you know, not everybody can work remotely. We're very fortunate we're going to stay on a permanent work from home basis. So I'd be curious in how you navigate that kind of minefield of starting to say, hey, you know, it's time to come back in. If you're vaccinated, we need you back in the office.
Okay, I think I'll tackle the first one on onboarding and termination, and then maybe we can tag team the last one there, Corinne. I do want to be cognizant of everybody's time.
Yeah.
I would say that, you know, the biggest thing when it comes to onboarding is switch your mindset and think about, how do I create a remote first experience for onboarding? Instead of thinking, how do I translate my in-person experience to a remote experience? That has been pivotal for us. We're actually going through a complete revamp of our onboarding internally with that mindset. And it has challenged us to think again and again, okay, if I go remote first, is it really valuable to have somebody sit on a Zoom call for 4 hours while I introduce them to everybody? Probably not. You know, maybe it's, you know, a bunch of 20-minute sessions throughout the day where you build in time for reflection and questions. Maybe you provide, you know, homework per se, but give them an assignment. You know, I want you to go and locate these things on our intranet, or I want you to go play with the HRIS and locate, you know, where do you change your taxes? How do you change direct deposit? Those kinds of things that you would show them in person, but you need to build in or bake into the culture from a a remote experience. Same thing for termination. I would say try to put that headset on of remote first, and I think you'll be surprised at the ideas that you come up with.
Good points. Thank you.
And I would echo what you just said about intentionality. So in the office, it's easy for that onboarding experience to be really organic, and you have this, you have the ability to just like pop over and talk to this person, and they kind of, you'll be like, hey, want to join me for this meeting because you're right here, and it'll be really helpful context for you to kind of absorb some of this conversation. But with a remote employee, they're in a lot of ways, they're out of sight, out of mind. So one of the things that we've found really helpful on my team is I've asked everyone on the team to set up initial one-on-ones with that person for a half an hour to over the period of a couple of weeks. It's not rapid fire, but tell them, what you do, tell them a little bit about yourself. Make it kind of a personal conversation, but also, give them more information about your role on the team. Let them ask you any questions that they have. That has been really successful for us in terms of building that relationship, because the relationship with the people that you work with is the foundation of having a successful team, and that's harder to build remotely. You have to do it on purpose. So I think that's something that I would really point to as a best practice there.
Yeah, I think you made me think about it as not trying to use your in-person format and converting it to remote, is just coming up with a brand new process for remote, which is a different way of thinking about it. So that's very helpful.
Yeah. And to your last question about bringing people back into the office, it's difficult. This is a difficult one. Let's just be honest, because you've had employees who've been out now a year, and if they've been successful, their argument's going to be, but why? Just because you want to, but why? So I think it's important to have a really good sense of your culture. I think do your homework, know how to answer that question. If it's just because I want to, that might be your answer, but then you got to live with the reality that that person might be leaving, because there's a lot of other companies who have decided, you know what, the roles that we can do remote, they're going to stay remote. But it could be hybrid. So, talking about onboarding, maybe onboarding is 2 weeks in the office because you want to have them inundated to your on-site culture, but the position is remote. So I would challenge to think that way. Corinne, would you have anything to add from what you're hearing in the industry from a compliance perspective?
And not really from a compliance perspective, but for the conversation about, can I require people to be vaccinated? That has been a very hot topic. But I actually believe, Dario, you said that you're having someone give an update on that in about 2 weeks. So I think that topic is certainly worth checking out. If you have time to attend that session, you absolutely should, if this is a question for your workforce. But just in terms of what I'm hearing generally on this topic, I'm certainly seeing organizations say, we are an in-person culture, everybody back in the office. So, for example, my sister-in-law, she works in a banking institution, and that is a very in-person culture. Right. It's a very formal culture. They're always, dressed for work in a way that, we at Paylocity are maybe a little bit more casual. But it's one of those things where that employer is now dealing with the fallout of that, where they told everyone they're back at the beginning of April. So everyone was supposed to be back in the office last week, and they're already starting to see that attrition because individuals are saying, I've proven to you that I can do this job remotely. You've seen that I'm successful at it. You've seen that I'm productive at it. I'm available. There's really no reason that, I should be pushed back into this office environment if I'm not ready for that, or if I'm not comfortable with that, or if my role simply doesn't really require that, as has always been the argument previously. And I think they're more or less taking the approach that, like, that's what they want. That's their culture. That's their organization. So those individuals who don't want to come back are seeking employment elsewhere, and that's kind of, I think, going to be a natural growing pain of that situation. So I think, we kind of touched on this a bit earlier, kind of thinking of it through the lens of, like, are there roles that could be done remotely in your organization? What does that look like? Is it an all or nothing proposition for you? And if it is, then it is, and there will be people that that no longer fit in that culture, and that's just kind of a choice that, each side of that employment relationship will have to make.
Right. Oh, really good points. I really appreciate it. I'll open it up. I know we're just slightly over. Anybody on the call that has any questions? sounds like maybe not. Well, I want to thank Corinne and Sherry again for really giving us some great valuable insight on the compliance of remote work environment and the challenges and pitfalls and opportunities really of where we are today and what's kind of we're facing in the future. Again, our enterprise and partnership with Paylocity, I really appreciate that. I failed to introduce Gabe King, one of our relationship managers over at Paylocity. So thank you, Gabe, for helping facilitate and coordinate this call. And again, to anybody, keep us in mind if we can be a resource for anything, soup to nuts. We're here to help and provide valuable content to you. So let us know. Again, thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful weekend. Here's to warm weather and springtime. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, guys.
All the day.
Thanks, guys.
Bye-bye.